Rafi Local Council of the state. On the interview segment for today, we shall be looking at Nigeria's economic outlook and investors' confidence with Kelvin Emmanuel, an economist, as our first guest. And later on, we discuss the Southeast as a future mainstream of Nigerian politics with Senator Ifeanyi, the senator representing Anambra South Senatorial District, as our second guest. Welcome to Politics Tonight, everyone. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Thank you so much for staying with us this evening. Now let's begin with some developments in the polity. The Nigerian Army says low fence and the absence of closed-circuit television cameras, CCTV, are largely responsible for the July 5th, 2022 Kuje jailbreak at the Kuje Correctional Center in Abuja. This was made known at an ongoing probe by the Joint Committee of the House of Reps on Reformatory Institutions, Justice, Police Affairs, Interior and Human Rights. National Assembly correspondent Tokadisa has details.
Almost 2 years after a jailbreak at the Kuje Correctional Center, members of the House of Representatives are still investigating the whereabouts of more than 400 inmates, including 64 convicted Boko Haram terrorists. 879 inmates were at the Kuje prison on the day of the attack. 422 of them escaped and remain at large. The lawmakers described the jailbreak as an embarrassing situation that must not be allowed to happen again.
To tell us what really happened. What is the effort of the military men? Is it that they did not have any security intel before that day?
The representative of the Chief of Army Staff said after the prison break, the Army observed that the place where Kuje prison is located is more of a built-up area.
Also observed issues of low fencing and the CCTV camera absence within the general area.
For the Attorney General of the Federation and Minister of Justice, decongesting the prisons is key to avoiding a recurrence of jailbreaks.
Federal Ministry of Justice greatly supported the efforts to decentralize the correctional service to allow states establish and manage their own correctional centers.
The Nigeria Police Force, Nigeria Security and Civil Defense Corps, and civil society groups also made varying inputs they believe will address the challenge at hand.
The INCOS maintains 265 custodial centers across the country with the capacity of 64,192 against a total inmates population of 78,519 as at 18th of March 2024.
President Bola Tinubu has affirmed that the challenges of insecurity will soon be over and the evil perpetrators cannot defeat the country. The president acknowledged current security challenges, but he insists his administration is on the verge of turning around the rising tide of insecurity. The president said this when he hosted principal officers of the Senate and some other senators to an iftar ceremony to break Ramadan fast inside the State House. President Tinubu also thanked the National Assembly for their support and partnership in ensuring executive bills are conceded. The president insisted the budgeting process is transparent and considers the interests of the country. The president of the Senate, Godswill Akpabio, expressed the commitment of lawmakers towards ensuring the renewed hope agenda succeeds.
The national challenge that we face will be over. The economic challenge, we're about turning the corner. Our revenue is improved. And you can see reflected in the subnational. All you have to do is fashion the Congress of the expenditure and manage ourselves much, much better. The light is on at the end of the tunnel, and Nigeria will smile again.
As part of a multi-agency approach to protecting schools in the country, the Nigerian military has launched a standard operating procedure. The launch indicates the commencement of the program by the military. Sifonesian reports.
Over 50 armed bandits struck the local markets in Madaka community in Rafi Local Government Council of Niger State. Local sources said no fewer than 21 persons were killed during the attack.
The recent kidnapping of students in Nigeria further threatens education development in a country where about 10.5 million children are not in school, even though the primary education is officially free and compulsory. The implementation of a multi-agency effort to protect schools from attack is at various levels under the Safe School program. The military, whose troops are in the front lines in several theaters of operation, is launching its standard operating procedures for protecting schools.
The interaction should in turn facilitate the design, implementation, monitoring and periodic evaluation of operational and administrative guidelines that will enhance our overall capacity as well as efficiency to provide a secured learning environment for our children. It is imperative to note that the volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous nature of the current security environment requires better synergy among the military and other security agencies.
This marks the takeoff of the Safe School program by the military to complement the efforts of other security agencies.
We cannot easily forget where we're coming from. The Nigerian educational system has always been in deep crisis on several fronts. Kidnappings of school children represented a major twist and existential threat of the nation's education system.
Let's take a short break, and when we return, it will be time to speak with our first guest of the day, Kelvin Emmanuel. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Politics Tonight, everyone. Tonight we shall be discussing Nigeria's economic outlook and investors' confidence. And to do justice to that conversation with me is Kelvin Emmanuel, an economist. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Emmanuel.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me tonight. It's such a pleasure to be.
Right, it's good to see you also. The Central Bank of Nigeria has now successfully cleared all valid foreign exchange backlogs. I mean, effectively eliminating a legacy burden. What is the impact of this on our economy?
Well, it's good news that the central bank has cleared the backlogs. $6.8 billion less about $2.4 billion that were invalidated for dividend and capital remittances from and commercial letters of credit, which is very, very crucial one. And now the journey is for the central bank to be able to raise the net reserve from where it is currently up to the balance of payment for 1 year. Nigeria's balance of payment for 1 year is estimated at $7 billion. If you raise the net reserves, gross reserves minus all the encumbrances to $7 billion, you'll be able to get the exchange rate at a stable level, and Nigerian banks will be able to maintain very clean commercial credit lines with their correspondent banks abroad, which will help them to be able to open commercial letters of credit for companies that import raw materials and capital equipment for manufacturing, the real sector, and which will correspondingly impact on inflation that is due to imported goods. So, I've said it severally that I am happy at the pace of reforms that the central bank has embarked on, and the reforms to the BDCs, the proposed reforms, the fact that the Senate is currently going through amendment reading, like they are passing like the CBN Act, trying to amend it, they sent a draft to the floor of National Assembly, the Senate, and they are currently debating the draft, the proposal. Central Bank of Nigeria said that it will not advance the federal government ways and means according to Section 38 of CBN Act 2007 if the government doesn't pay back what it owes Central Bank of Nigeria. It's also proposing that amendment, for example, that is placing a hard stop. That's like an irrevocable payment, standing payment order that will not enable the federal government to borrow from the central bank without pledging in their FAC allocation as a collateral for the loan. And that loan can only last for 3 years.
Right, so I must confirm that Nigerians are taken aback by a report that Nigeria's inflation is expected to rise to 32.63% in March. For you, what are the indices? Mr. Emmanuel, can you hear me? Mr. Kevin Emmanuel, are you there? Mr. Emmanuel, if you can hear me, like I said earlier, Nigeria's inflation is expected to rise to 32.63% in March, and that's this month. So for you, what are the indices? So take more stories while that gets fixed. In the meantime, all right, so let's go on a short break and we will be right back. Please stay with Politics Tonight.
Experience information and entertainment like never before as TVC Breakfast takes your weekends to a whole new level. Introducing TVC Breakfast Weekend Edition, your ultimate source of thrilling sports updates, insightful political analysis, and captivating entertainment news. Stay in the know with what's trending, catch up with the latest in sports, and immerse yourself in the latest buzz from the world of music and movies. Your weekends are no longer just days off, but moments packed with knowledge, excitement, and enjoyment. TVC Breakfast Weekend Edition, only on TVC News.
TVC Communications Muslim Community invites you to our 2024 Ramadan lectures on Saturday, 23rd of March 2024. Topics: addressing insecurity and food crisis in Nigeria, the Islamic perspective, to be delivered by Sheikh Dhikrullah Shafi, Grand Mufti, Conference of Islamic Organizations.
Welcome back to Politics Tonight, everyone. Thank you so much for staying with us. Tonight, we're discussing Nigeria's economic outlook and investors' confidence. And an economist, Kelvin Emmanuel, is on the program with me tonight. Mr. Emmanuel, like I said earlier before we went on that break, Nigeria's inflation is expected to rise to 32.63%. What are the indices for you?
So the major contributors to inflation, like we know, is food and energy prices. It doesn't help that most of our what forms our energy baskets, transportation and non-transportation fuels, which are transportation fuels are typically called white fuels. So you have the Jet A1, you have the aviation, automotive gasoline, oil, AGO, you have the premium motor spirits. Most of it is imported into Nigeria currently. It doesn't also help that for example, the largest commercial refiner in Nigeria, Dangote, is unable to source 100% of what is currently producing from Nigeria, is having to import some of that feedstock into Nigeria because of FSAs and because of commitments the production from Nigeria has currently. So we're unable to get the full comparative advantage we would have gotten in terms of lower energy prices from the energy basket from a commercial refiner that refines locally because of the cost of landing petroleum products into Nigeria and because of the use around the FX rates that we currently have. So that contributes a major deal to the prices of goods and services in the market today, which is why inflation keeps going up. I expect that, for example, at the 294th meeting of the Monetary Policy Committee next week, they're going to raise the MPR rate again by another 150 to 200 basis points. But then that tightening comes at the risk of you having the non-performing loan book of banks continue to go up above the weighted average that the central bank has set. The Financial Stability Department of the central bank has set banking supervision for the commercial banks in Nigeria, which will pose like a systemic risk, because usually when non-performing loan book goes up for banks, it affects their total risk-weighted assets, which impacts on their capital adequacy. So these are the impacts, right? So on one side, it's good to tighten. On the other side, it increases the cost of capital, and it tightens the ability for banks to lend to the real sector, which will impact on production. So it's a tricky point. And this is the reason why, despite all the progress that the central bank has made, the fiscal authorities need to come in to support the central bank by restructuring the economy. And my key critical areas are to raise revenue to GDP ratio, both for tax and non-tax, harmonize the taxes, federal, state, and local government, taxes and levies to 10, like the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Reforms has proposed.
All right.
It also.
All right. I mean, because you talked about restructuring, for ages now, we've been talking about diversifying from oil and giving more boost to exports. Why does it seem so hard to get the economy functioning at its best?
So, there are legacy problems that the country has. For example, the Debt Management Office came out with a statement earlier today that Nigeria's debt is currently around 97.8 trillion naira, which is about $109 billion, if I'm not mistaken, and that the external debt stock is about 38 trillion of that. So your debt to GDP ratio is close to 40%, and the interest on debt is high. And if you look at the 2024 Appropriation Act, you see that you have debt servicing costs above 7 trillion naira for 2024. So there are legacy issues that the current administration met. So I'm a bit measured when I criticize the current administration, because I have an understanding of what it inherited from its predecessor. It inherited a really, really, really bad position. When this government came in last year, they were unable to borrow money from the Eurobonds market. It's still difficult to borrow now because Nigeria has a junk credit rating. If you go to the Eurobonds market to raise money, you have to borrow at about 15% in terms of coupon, and you might not get any moratorium on that debt. Nigeria's country risk premium is over 17%, which is like the credit default swap rates that investors charge to price in your bonds. Nigeria is supposed to pay $1.2 billion in terms of coupons to investors next year. And so it's a very difficult situation. The president has a situation where he's asking, how do I fund the budget? And then the deficit financing budget is 48%. It's good the president is beginning to send the right message. For example, he announced that he's going to suspend traveling for one entire quarter of all his cabinet members. It's a good signal to Nigerians that it's tightening, but it's also important that he goes ahead and implements the Stephen Orasanya report that is proposed to reduce the number of parastatals from 262 down to probably below 150. It's also important that the president is able to reform the act that establishes the Bureau of Public Procurement, because there's a lot of procurement fraud in Nigeria, to reduce the cost of capital projects in Nigeria. So, I think the president is on the right track, but it's important for him to prevail on his Minister of Finance and Coordinating Economy to improve revenues and to empower him with the reforms that he proposed in 2023 to be able to support the Central Bank of Nigeria. Because if you leave all the weight on the central bank, if you don't increase food production, if you don't backwardly integrate energy production midstream, if you don't increase the amount of investment that goes into gas upstream to be able to raise more revenues, if you don't increase the number of oil rigs, if you don't reduce the amount of crude oil theft in Niger Delta, you place all the demand on CBN, and CBN will just keep raising the rates, to fight inflation, and that will completely damage the real economy, which is what we're seeing today.
Okay, so while we wait for the implementation of the Orasanya report, an improper perspective now, how do you think government can balance policies on exports while also diversifying?
So when it comes to exports, the question you have to ask yourself is, what's the ease of doing business in Nigeria? Companies actually able to produce. what goes into their production. I'll tell you. So, for example, a company, for example, that makes mayonnaise has to import egg yolk powder. It's not very easy to get soybean oil. Yeah, soybean oil is produced in Nigeria. Vinegar, has to be imported. And a company, for example, that manufactures drugs, for example, pharmaceuticals, they have to import, they have active pharmaceutical ingredients. So when you look at the supply chain for a lot of what companies produce for exports, you ask yourself, do you want to operate like a manufacturing model where you import raw materials and then you export finished products? What is going to be your comparative advantage? On the other hand, when you look at the National Export Promotion Council, and you look at something like the Export Expansion Grants, the EEGs, the EEG program, for example, needs to be reformed. The situation where companies collect EEGs and then they sell it to third parties at a discounted rate is just not working. The situation, for example, also where the government gives EEGs to companies that are exporting raw materials, for example, soybean, CCM seeds, it's not working. The government needs to, reform that program to only give grants in terms of promissory notes that you can use to reduce your tax, to only companies who are adding value to raw materials. So, for example, if you're exporting sesame seeds, the government will not give you export expansion grants. Instead, the government will say, we'll only give you if you're able to process the sesame into sesame cake and sesame oil, which will give you more in terms of revenue if you export than if you just export the raw material. So these are the kind of structural amendments that the Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment needs to make to support, in terms of reforming industrial policy of the country, to support the ability to make more money from exports and give us a favorable balance of trade advantage.
Right, but in practical terms, what should government do to boost investment and ease the cost of doing business in Nigeria, and also bring down the cost of goods and services?
So the number one fear a lot of institutional investors have about coming to Nigeria is the exchange rate. There are three major things. They call it the basket that forms your forward guidance. And this is the reason why I've advocated for the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank to have what they call the dot plot. Dot plot, a graph that enables the Central Bank governors and the Monetary Policy Committee members, which also comprises of the board that was appointed by the president, the Central Bank, to show where exactly they are in terms of if they are hawkish or if they are dovish. Hawkish means they are bullish on raising MPR rates. Dovish means they are bearish on raising MPR rates. So give forward guidance to investors on returns, on inflation, on exchange rates, and on interest rates. These are the three major factors that determine whether investors want to come into the country or not. Because investors are asking themselves, if I bring in $500 million to Nigeria today, if I'm going to take that money out in 1 year, where's the exchange rate going to be? What is the external risk of the exchange rate, of devaluation and depreciation of the currency on my internal rate of return? So if, for example, over 12 months, I make 25% on $500 million, is there a possibility that the risk of exchange rate fluctuations might be higher than the 25% return I make on my money? This is the most fundamental thing that we need to pay attention to. So it's the Monetary Policy Committee needs to give forward guidance, and they can only give forward guidance if they are sure of what the fiscal authorities are doing.
All right. Let's also bring in another angle to this conversation. The president has been traveling from one country to another, negotiating trade deals and signing MOUs. When should Nigerians begin to see and feel the impact of these travels?
So I'm under no illusion that it's going to take 6 months or 12 months for the president to turn the country around. He inherited a mess. That's the reality of it. He inherited a whole mess. It's going to take time. To take at least 4 to 5 years for you to begin to see the impact of the changes. Even if I expect him to make more changes, I personally think that his cabinet is not a full representation of the kind of reforms and the results that he's trying to chase. And I think that at the annual review of his cabinet by the policy coordination team later in the year, I think in May, the president needs to look at his team again, critical sectors that will impact on his reforms and the results he's expecting. So I'll tell you, for example, that if you look at oil and gas, which is the bread and butter of Nigeria, And as much as we want to talk about diversification, oil and gas is the bread and butter of Nigeria. I'll tell you what. Despite all the problems Russia has with the world, sanctions, removal of Russia from the SWIFT system of banking that has over 12,000 banks, Russian banks unable to open LC, Russia Nord Stream 1 was destroyed, was placed on an embargo, Nord Stream 2 was sabotaged. Despite all the issues Russia has, Russia still generated $99.4 billion from oil and gas last year. So we need to be able to look at NNPC as a company, for example, and strip it apart. We need to get NNPC through reforms, take it to IPO, raise capital, invest in projects upstream and midstream. NNPC needs to become an operator so that they can rely less on joint oil agreements and production sharing contracts to be able to raise how much of revenue that is not encumbered they bring into the Federation, FX, stabilize the economy. They need to invest in floating LNG vessels. They need to invest in export pipelines for gas to be able to supply Europe with gas to raise revenues that Nigeria needs to stabilize FX markets and also reduce the budget deficit. Because at the end of the day, if you trace the history of the problems, economic problems we have, at the foundation of it, budget deficits. In the last 10 years, budget deficits has gone from about 16.8% to about 48%. And that's the foundation of the issues like ways and means that impacted on you having monies through QE that is not backed by assets or reserves, and that led to devaluation of the currency and all the issues we're currently having today. So it's going to take a while. It's going to take the president like 4 to 5 years to get his feet on the ground and be able to find a bearing to a level where the economy is fully stable, and they're able to say, okay, we have up to 4% or 4.5% GDP growth rate per annum, or unemployment is coming down, or we're able to get inflation back to 12 to 15% levels, and all of those very stable metrics.
But if you also look at the president's open door policy to investors from around the world, what's your impression about it?
Well, it's actually encouraging that the president is, when he was in Doha, he spoke to, I think, the business council, maybe the Chamber of Commerce, Nigeria Chamber of Commerce, about corruption in Nigeria and the fact that he's not going to condone it. And if, for example, there is any issue of any Nigerian official requesting for a bribe, they should personally come to him, to intervene and address the situation. It's a good development. It's very good that the president is, actively leading the charge on talking to businesses. He was in India, he spoke to businesses, is selling the country, because at the end of the day, the president is the country's #1 salesperson and brand ambassador. However, I think the president needs to focus on critical reforms. He needs to focus on critical reforms because it's not enough for you to promise investors that Nigeria is ripe for them to come in. They have concerns, and if those concerns are not addressed, it's going to be difficult for him to get foreign direct investments to the levels where we had it 8-10 years ago.
All right, Mr. Kelvin, let's take a break, and when we come back, we will continue this conversation. Please stay with us. You're watching Politics Tonight, everyone.
Business lives on the fast track of numbers. Business is a strange world where low numbers means something different. In its currency are speed and time. Finding the open doors of Main Street is not just good business, it's the start of the business. Join us every weekend on Business Week.
TVC Communications Muslim Community invites you to our 2024 Ramadan lectures on Saturday, 23rd of March 2024. Topics: addressing insecurity and food crisis in Nigeria, the Islamic perspective, to be delivered by Sheikh Dhikrullah Shafi, Grand Mufti, Conference of Islamic Organizations. Also, the topic, Global Financial Downturn and Prospects of Islamic Banking in Nigeria, will be delivered by Abdul Karim Arileshiri, Associate, Institute of Islamic Finance Professionals. Chairpersons of the day, Dr. Mukai Aremu Akinde, Rector, Federal Polytechnic Ilaro, and Princess Samiet Abonale Bada, Mayoress Ikosi Sherry LCDA. Side attractions include Quranic competition for children and Islamic quiz competition with lots of generous gifts for the guests. Join us for the 2024 TVC Muslim Community Ramadan Lectures this Saturday, 23rd of March 2024 at the TVC Communications Headquarters Field. Time, 11 a.m. prompt. Ramadan Kareem. Be there.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Politics Tonight, and we're still discussing Nigeria's economic outlook and investors' confidence. And I've been speaking with Kelvin Emmanuel, an economist. Mr. Emmanuel, let's move on with this conversation. And, I mean, when we say government, obviously we're not only referring to the federal, but also state government. What is the role of the state governors in the revival of this country's economy?
That is a very important question because subnationals are very, very key. The subnationals, we look at Nigeria debt stock, subnationals are between 14 and 15% of the total debt stock. And the fact that lesson rate is what it is has affected, it's led to serious revaluation losses for the state governments. I honestly think that there are very critical reforms that needs to be made. For example, I'm encouraged by the fact that the president has called the governors to the FEC, and he's mentioned to them about state police, which has been a subject of hot debate for a very long time. If we're going to address the issue of national security, we have to realize that a federal policing or central policing system just doesn't work. That's the reality of it. We can decide to go around the topic, dance around the topic, and massage the topic, but the reality is that the federal policing or central policing system is not working. So the president proposing state policing system works. But the president, in order to ensure that there's checks and balance and doesn't lead to abuse by state governors, needs to work on ensuring that the reforms his predecessor made for the fifth alteration to the 1999 Constitution, where the National Assembly said, listen, we give financial autonomy to the judiciary, state judiciary, and the State House of Assembly, is done. And that the governors also do not have control over the funds that are designated for the local governments. Because what you have today is that the governors practically control the 774 local governments in Nigeria. And I think Ekiti State is the only state that was able to say, look, you know what, we're going to, when the whole issue of financial autonomy for judiciary came up, Ekiti State took the lead in giving full financial autonomy to the state judiciary. You need the Nigerian Governors Forum to come together and be able to address this issue of financial autonomy to local governments, as stated in this thing. Because when you look at that Revenue Mobilization and Fiscal Allocation Commission, the federating units, federal government has 55%, state government have 29%, local government has 16%. For you, for example, to create strong D roads, farm settlement roads that will help production, food production, primary food production, you need local governments, not state governments. And for that to happen, local governments have to be financially independent and they have to elect their chairman. This is very critical and important. Also, the president needs to focus on being able to change the principles of derivation. I think this is a very hot button political topic. There are 5 principles of derivation that ensures that sets the tone for how monies are shared according to the federating units, land mass, equity of state population. You have IGR and then you have derivation. So I like this example because it explains this issue. Lagos State has the smallest land mass in Nigeria, 30,527 square meters, but the IGR Lagos generates alone is equivalent to 26 states in Nigeria. So how do you set population, land mass, as a metric for dividing revenues along federating units? You need to let the states to generate their revenues. You need to amend the exclusive legislative list, the 68 items that makes up the legislative list, the exclusive, concurrent, and residual list, and give more autonomy to the states to be able to be financially independent, rely less on loans, rely less on federal government intervention, and take control of their lives, basically, and answer their fact. That is what the president needs to do to make the state government. There are structural reforms that are not easy to do because it's easy to say, but they are not easy to do because it needs the support of the National Assembly. And you basically have a National Assembly that is polarized, even if the ruling party has majority in the House. He's going to need to work to lobby the National Assembly to ensure that they go along with the reforms, but without these structural reforms, it's going to be difficult for him to really get the state governors to act. Because just telling them that this is what he wants is not going to work without creating the legal backing and framework for them to work.
All right, so I get that, but one major concern has been the fact that state governors have, for some months now, have had increased FAC allocation, but some of them do have nothing to show for it in alleviating this hardship on their citizens. How do we continue to hold them accountable?
Well, so yeah, they've had increasing FAC allocation from the removal of petrol subsidy. And yes, they've not shown, a lot of states have not shown anything for it so far. But then again, it comes back to financial autonomy. There are two major arms of government that will hold the governors accountable, and that's the state judiciary, and especially the State House of Assembly. Without financial autonomy for these two major arms of government at state levels, you're just not going to have anything, because what you have today is that the state governors are lords. They control the show. So for the president to be able to ensure that he has House of Assemblies and state judiciaries that are able to hold governors to account, he needs to give financial autonomy to them. So everything the president can do to ensure that they have their financial independence, he has to do. That's the way to checkmate them.
All right, I hear that. But earlier in the year, President Tinubu said roadblocks to economic growth have been removed with a pledge to maintain the momentum. Part of these are multiple taxations and levies, as well as customs duties that are imposed on businesses. Private business and entrepreneurs like yourself should be smiling at this point, don't you think?
Well, so far, the president has not implemented the recommendations of the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Reforms to reduce the number of taxes to 10, harmonize the tax code. That will need National Assembly to work, because the Federal Inland Revenue Service works on an act that was passed at the National Assembly. So for them to work on the tax code, he needs to communicate his vision to the National Assembly, and he needs to lobby them to ensure that they can harmonize the tax code. It's very, very critical. Also, I honestly believe, and I've said this severally, that I don't believe the Nigerian Customs Service should be in charge of collecting revenues for the Nigerian government.
Who should be in charge of it?
Be the exclusive preserve of the Federal Inland Revenue Service.
Okay.
The customs is for trade facilitation, and the customs should move from Federal Ministry of Finance to Federal Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment, because they're supposed to be for trade facilitation. I don't think that the current system of revenue collection works very well. And in terms of taxes and levies, especially illegal taxes and levies, unless the president can harmonize the tax code and change fundamental areas that governs tax collection and system and bring the informal economy into the formal economy, it's going to be very difficult for you to have us improving that ease of doing business metric in Nigeria that will encourage investors and companies to put more money on the ground.
All right, we'll come to that if time permits us. Let's go back to CBN. There was a circular, the circular that was issued by the CBN in January to banks addressing suspected cases of excessive foreign currency speculation and hoarding. There were this requirement as well. Do you think banks have adhered to those requirements? And two, how has that influenced the look of things? If it has, to what degree?
Well, so the circular where the central bank said that in terms of net open positions long, banks are obligated to keep 0% net open positions long and 20% net positions short. I don't think the banks have fully implemented it. It boils down to the governor and the deputy governor in charge of financial system stability and the director in charge of banking supervision to ensure that the banks comply. and that banks don't hold, because you have what they call your all-in rates, second check, which is the difference between the rate at which the dealers get and the rate at which they quote in the I&E market. But you can see that basically the fact that you've had an alignment in terms of the official rate and the parallel market rate, and there was a time like 2 or 3 weeks ago when the official rate went above the parallel market rate, it's difficult for banks to be able to make money from that arbitrage trade that they were making, that encouraged them to keep over $5 billion onshore long on net open positions, and, cause speculations in the FX markets in Nigeria. But I'll tell you that so far, I'm happy with the pace of changes and reforms. I just hope that, the central bank can keep at the pace and they can enforce the decisions that have been made and the circular that has been sent out. I also think that another thing that the central bank needs to deal with is the revaluation losses and revaluation gains. And where it's going to be interesting to see what the books of the central bank will look like when they come out with their annual audit report according to Section 50 of the CBN Act of 2007.
Right. So earlier you talked about how you think the president must address the issue of multiple taxation. So I wanted to ask, how important is data accessibility in this? I mean, you and I know that our country, Nigeria, we have a data problem. How important is data in addressing this challenge?
So this comes back to the question of, the tax authorities, State Inland Revenue Service, employing consultants to be able to work with consultants to bring in the informal sector of the economy into the formal sector of the economy, in terms of partnership between the Federal Inland Revenue Service and the State Inland Revenue Service. So, for example, you can have a situation where there's an MOU between FIRS and State Inland Revenue Service, and the State Inland Revenue Service that are more on the ground and they understand the system can drive collection of federal taxes, and they collect a small percentage on performance. Again, on the other side of this debate is the fact that, some people have said that, when the Minister of FCT, current minister, was governor of Rivers State, he had sued the federal government, asking for him to be able to collect VAT and federal personal income taxes at the state level. And, he got an order at the federal high court, I think, state high court in Rivers State, and the former Attorney General challenged that in court. So I think it's important for us to define our tax strategy and make amendments. This is the reason why we need to harmonize our tax code. This is the reason why all those illegal taxes and levies in Rivers State, for example, there are about 96 different taxes and levies that businesses pay. If you be able to harmonize it and bring the informal sector of the economy into the formal sector of the economy and bring that down to 10, it will help businesses to be able to plan, and it will reduce how much of that they price into the cost of their goods and services.
Right. So, Mr. Kelvin, I want us to go back to some of the president's moves in attracting foreign investors to this country. And I remember that in November, Nigeria and Saudi Arabia agreed to a deal to revive the country's non-functional refineries, with a revamp to be completed within a 2 or 3 year time frame. I want you to speak to the economic impact of this deal.
I am not in support of government-owned refineries, because I don't think government...
You're not in support of it?
I'm not in support of it. I don't think the government can manage business. I am of the opinion that the government needs to get away from the business of refining crude oil. The last of 210,000 barrels combined capacity in Port Harcourt, for example, Port Harcourt refinery was completed in 1989 by British Petroleum and Shell. I don't think the government needs to be in that business. I think the government should focus on regulation and have, for example, NNPC transferred to an asset manager. I think NNPC should be supervised by an asset manager, which is the Ministry of Finance Incorporated. And for example, the government set up the Ministry of Petroleum Incorporated. I think they do the same thing. I think an asset manager will be better at being able to maximize shareholder value, with the Nigerian government federating units being major shareholders in NNPC, for example, which is your cash cow. I think NNPC as a company needs to become a private business, fully private business outside of the control of the government, and with the control of the major shareholder, which will be the asset manager representing the federal government of Nigeria as an investor in the company. And the government needs to, for example, focus on, NNPC, for example, needs to focus on raising capital from the capital markets, investing in upstream and midstream projects like increasing number of oil rigs, exploring non-associated gas. The president recently came up with an executive order on granting fiscal incentives to companies who want to invest in non-associated gas fields, because most of the gas we have today, we do about 5.6 billion standard cubic feet on a daily basis, and most of that gas is from associated gas that are trapped when crude oil comes out of the wellhead, both onshore and midwaters and offshore. The president needs to focus on, turning NNPC into a cash cow. And look at the example of Aramco, and the only way he can do that is if he allows an asset manager to manage the federal government shares in NNPC and invest in strategic areas upstream and midstream to be able to maximize value. I don't think the play for having the refineries work will reduce significantly the price of petrol, because at the end of the day, if that is the objective, the government is going to end up having a refinery where it's still paying a subsidy on whatever comes out, because you being able to manage a refinery does not mean that your real costs of production is going to come significantly lower than what you have in the deregulated markets.
All right, so if I get you clearly, are you saying privatization is the way to go here?
Those refineries are very old, and so you need experts, for example, to come in to assess the technical capability ratio of those refineries, Port Harcourt, Warri, and Kaduna refineries. Kaduna, for example, is not viable because of the cost of transportation of crude oil to Kaduna. So you're stuck with Port Harcourt and Warri, for example. For me, I would tell the government that maybe you can strip it down and sell it off to investors who want to, put money down into it. The work here is for you to work on being able to provide the refineries in Nigeria with crude oil feedstock. That's the work. Okay. So if at the end of the day you have a fully deregulated market, are you able to say, okay, we're applying a subsidy on verifiable consumption levels? So, for example, I'll tell you my number on how much of petrol Nigeria consumes every day is not more than 35 million liters per day. I'm happy that when the president came last year, we were able to get that number from what his predecessor had at 66 million down to about 41 million liters per day. But I think he still needs to reduce it by another 11 million liters by working on verifying not just supply to the poor, but also the demand numbers, confirming demand and ensuring that there's no smuggling of petrol across borders in Nigeria for arbitrage opportunities. So for me, the play is not for the government to own refineries and end up subsidizing it,
okay,
and run it inefficiently. The game is to be able to get enough substantial crude oil feedstock and not have a commercial refinery in Nigeria importing crude oil feedstock.
Right, because you're talking about refineries, the president also welcomed new trade agreements with Germany, including a deal that calls for the West African nation to export liquid natural gas. And under one deal, and that's Riverside LNG of Nigeria will supply 850,000 tons of liquefied natural gas to Germany each year. And according to that deal, the first delivery of gas is expected in 2026. From your own perspective, what's the significance of this?
I think it's significant, and I think the LNG presents a huge opportunity for Nigeria. I think Transocean opened an FID for about 3 million metric tons 2 years ago in 2022. I don't know how far that is going today. Gola LNG, they have a JV with NNPC, and they opened something for an FID, final investment decision, for 7 million metric tons there. I think they already committed capital to building 30 floating LNG vessels that will be delivered sometime late 2026, early 2027, and that can do up to 7 million metric tons of LNG and increase our output. So, for example, even if Train 7 comes for an inland train, the question a Nigerian LNG is going to ask you is, where are you going to get the gas feedstock to provide Train 7? Because Train 7 is supposed to add about 8 million metric tons to the current 22 million metric tons. But today, as we speak, LNG currently has 70% capacity utilization, in terms of how much feedstock it gets to be able to produce gas. And I don't think NNPC is out of force majeure which it has been in since 2022. So, for example, in 2024, when they release their financial number, I don't expect the NLNG will do more than $1 billion in terms of dividends. Talk more of capital, corporate income taxes and withholding taxes that they also pay to Federal Land Revenue Service. So, there's a lot of opportunity for LNG for Nigeria because, Germany, for example, is increasing its capacity, infrastructure capacity for what they call floating storage regasification units. They're basically like units that accept LNG as gas, are able to store it, close to, ports, and then store it for a long time. And then when they need it, they regasify it into natural gas and then they use. So they are signing deals. They've signed a deal with Qatar Gas, and the government needs to work on increasing its LNG capacity because LNG presents a very, very significant opportunity because LNG is what you need, for example, to be able to actually reduce to the barest minimum how much of gas is fled at associated gas plants offshore in Nigeria and also onshore. So if you have FLNG vessels offshore, you reduce how much of gas you flare and you'll be able to maximize that wasted gas into LNG. You'll also be able to, because, if you look at the natural gas mix, methane, which is the principal component for processing LNG, actually 80%. And then propane and ethane and butane are actually like 5.6%. You'll be able to also increase how much of LPG that Nigeria gets to be able to reduce how much of LPG we import for cooking gas and also industrial gas use. So LNG presents a very, very strategic opportunity for the Nigerian government to not just supply Europe with gas, but also earn revenues it needs to be able to stabilize its budget. All
right, Kelvin Emmanuel, thank you so much for always doing justice to some most of this conversation. We sincerely appreciate your time with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much.
Right, so we're sorry we could not bring the conversation with Senator Ifeanyi, but we've rescheduled that to another time. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and that's all we have on Politics Tonight. Please have a great weekend. Good night, everyone.